Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to ArtsFest Online. This evening we will be joining Mike Layward, Artistic Director of DASH, Disability Arts in Shropshire, for his talk We Are Invisible, We Are Visible. Mike will be taking us through the last 50 years of disability activism and disability art. If you have any questions during the talk for Mike, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll go through them at the end of the talk. Welcome Mike, over to you.
Thanks Claire, and welcome everyone. Thanks for coming, and yeah, I hope you're going to find this a gripping tour. So we are invisible, we are visible. I thought I'd start, there's going to be quite a lot of art here, so I'll try and do a description in case anyone's partially sighted, but I think it's also good to do the description anyway. And this piece of work is called Great Britain from a Wheelchair by Tony Heaton. And Tony Heaton's quite a key figure in the disability art and disability rights movement. He was the CEO or artistic director of Shape Arts in London, which has been going since the 1970s, so been a key organisation for the development of disabled artists. And he's also an artist, so he's made some really brilliant work. This work is, I think it is one wheelchair, it could be two wheelchairs that were like government issue from about the 1980s, and he's created it into a map of Britain. So this bit of work is quite based on the sort of Dadaist theme as well, and also that sort of assemblage and found objects. An outline of the talk. So I'm going to go through slide by slide, looking at different aspects around the disability rights movement, the Disability Discrimination Act, and also disability arts and disabled artists. So there's quite a lot to get through. I thought quickly I'd just talk a bit about myself, who I am. So I grew up in London in Hackney in the 1950s. Very interesting area then. It was very multicultural, still is, but unusual for London at that time. And I think I was lucky that because it was the 1950s, my impairment wasn't recognised. Otherwise, I would have probably spent 18 months or more in hospital as a young kid, which would have done me a lot of harm. So that's a bit of my history. My family was Jewish, and this job that I'm doing now as the artistic director of DASH, I've been doing that for about 20 years, and it's brilliant. I'll tell a bit more about DASH later in the talk. So the title, We Are Invisible, We Are Visible. Why did I choose that? I think it's because at this time particularly, I think it's so apt. The impact of lockdown on disabled people has been so, it's been, I think for all of us during the lockdown, and the impact of coronavirus has been so polarized, so extreme. For a lot of disabled people, it hasn't been any different. Their lives have been very home-based. And so the lockdown is actually been where I'll tell you about that in a minute, but it's been like everyone else has joined the sort of lifestyle that for those people, they've been living for years. One woman, a neurodivergent artist, has written a piece about being a hermit, and she's just saying, I suddenly got all this pressure taken off me, because before lockdown, I always felt like the world was going by and I was missing it, but suddenly everyone's in my world and I know how to navigate my world while everyone else is finding it really difficult. And another aspect that I think is really strong, especially early on when people were talking about herd immunity, and I keep hearing that coming up, the idea that people who, I'm going to use this word vulnerable because that was the words that were being used. It's not a word I would use because I think vulnerable says that somehow you're not perfect and you're at danger, and actually the danger isn't you, it's the situation you're put in by society. But if those people shield, the people who shield, everyone can get on with their life as normal. And if you think a step further on that, it's great. We can go back to the 1950s when loads of disabled people were institutionalized and the world could carry on without having to deal with disabled people. So I'm really glad that that hasn't happened, but it shows that the ever-going danger of that sort of concept of disabled people being put away, put out of sight. So that's where we are invisible, but we are also visible. I also want to just introduce this idea around disability art and the art world, because a real issue in the art world is that art history, everything is based around art history. If you want to show in major galleries, you have to position yourself in art history allied to a particular movement and show how your work relates to that. And an issue there is that disability art isn't in art history. There's a nice piece of work that an artist called Sarah Fanelli was commissioned by the Tate Gallery to produce about art history. And it's a fold out. You can buy it in the shop, you can buy it online. And as you get up into the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, you start to get movements like feminism, women's art, queer art, and Black art. And then you think, well, disability art's going to appear, and it doesn't appear. And it's not recognized as part of the canon of that. I use that word canon, the movement of art history. It's not part of art history. Why is that? I have no idea. I think people can understand within the art world that there's plenty of artists who are disabled artists, or artists who happen to have a disability, so that they make art and the fact that they have a disability is irrelevant. And that is not what disability art is about. Disability art is art that's made by disabled people that reflects their experience. Obviously, this work we're looking at of Tony's is right in your face, and it's clearly about wheelchairs, but a lot of the work you're going to see is artists aren't going to be so polemic. They're not going to be so direct. The ideas are much more complex, but the very fact that you've grown up as a disabled person and you've got the lived experience, artists make work that comes from themselves. If it doesn't come from themselves, the work won't be any good, it will be crap. So it can't help but be from their experience as disabled people. So this is a battle that I think is going to be ongoing, and I'm really working out how can we change art history. I haven't got the answer yet, but when I do, if anyone out there has, please tell me. So there's my email address. So if any questions come up in the following days that you want to send me, or you want to ask me things about Dash or about anything in this presentation, then do email me at that address. So here's a picture of an art piece called Camp Dag. And the artist who's in the wheelchair with the ginger hair is Catherine Aranello. And on her right, with a guitar, is Aaron Williamson. And they make up something called DAG, which is the Disabled Avant-Garde. And just to describe the picture, there's about 8 or 9 people sitting around a campfire with some smoke in a field. And this piece was, they were commissioned in Newtown by Oriel Davies Gallery as part of a program we were running. And their commission that they put in was to make like a traveller's camp, but it was only made up of disabled people. So it was there for about 3 days in the park in Newtown. And it was quite a bizarre piece of work, but their work is always like that. And they want to challenge stereotypes, but they also want to have fun. And also the avant-garde, that their work is usually quite cranky and it doesn't fit neatly. It's live art, performance art. So this next piece is by an American artist who's got a South Korean background, Christine Sun Kim. And Christine's a deaf artist. And this image is it's musical notes, but they look like an N shape. And then at the bottom it says one too many voices. So it's I think it's an ink drawing. And Christine got really interested. I think she's still living in Berlin now. She moved from New York to Berlin. But when she was younger, she went to Berlin as an artist, and she went in all these beautiful white spaces, and they had nothing in them. They were just lit and empty. And she thought, wow, I love the simplicity of these. And then some friends told her they were sound art. And then she got really interested in what she was missing as a deaf person. What was the art that she wasn't hearing? And so she started creating work that turned the sound into vibrations, or she used like great big speakers with diaphragms on, with putting paint on so that the sound would make art. And then she started working with choirs and using the voice in very avant-garde ways. So Christine, that sort of way of working as a disabled or a deaf person is what I would say, you know, is quite the root of disability art. So Dash, we're a disability visual arts organisation. So we predominantly, well, I'd say 99% of our work is in the visual arts, and that's been for the last 10 years. And we focus on the visual arts because we found that most of the artists we were working with were visual artists. Plus, the visual arts is a much harder nut to crack. Artists work predominantly alone, so they're quite isolated, whether they're disabled or non-disabled. Galleries are a bit like castles. They're really hard to know how you can make the connection to get your work in there. And it's felt that the representation of disabled artists and disability art is being very, very poor and very little, slowly changing. So I think that's why we took on this challenge. And other work that we do in Dash is we do mentoring. So we're running a mentoring program that's open to any disabled artist. You can contact me through that email, mike@arts.org. It's free. And I think it's important at this time because I'm really concerned about particularly emerging artists, whether they're young or old, who haven't built up the contacts within the arts world that you need to survive, because it's a very elitist structure, mostly the arts. It's about who you know and those people who have positions that can make connections for you. So we're really trying to use this time to help support those artists who haven't yet built up those contacts by either making contacts or helping them organize their sort of business structures. We also work with young disabled artists because they're the artists of tomorrow. I was just going to read a poem by one of the mentees because I asked a couple of the mentees who are poets to send me poems. So this is quite a short one. It's by an artist called Emma Plover. In other words, a science fiction utopia, by the power of subversive imagining, describes a visionary society that could possibly exist for people to achieve their full potential. Thanks for that, Emma. Here's a saying. It's not just Bob Marley, but I'm trying to remember which song this came from. If you know your history, then you would know where you're coming from. And really interestingly, I heard recently some of the young Black activists in Black Lives Matter saying to Black elders, you haven't taught us our history. We don't know where we come from. And if we don't know where we come from, then how can we move forward? And I think the same story is exactly the same for disabled people. We need to know our history. We need to know where we got to at this time and how we got there. I mean, one of the things I'm really interested in is the history of institutionalization, because going back to that early part of the talk around the lockdown and the herd mentality, because when I started working in the arts in the 70s, and I remember I was working in Swindon and we were doing a project with learning disabled adults. And we found out that at that time, most of those learning disabled adults were institutionalized in mental hospitals. It's a bit hard to believe. So the older learning disabled people who were in those institutions were institutionalized. They'd been there 20, 30, 40 years or longer. And they weren't going to move out. But the younger people who were there were being moved out into more like into home bases, not institutions. And that's not very long ago. That was about 1976, 77. So what is that? That's 40, just over 40 years ago. And the institutionalization, I think a lot of disabled people fear that we could be coming back to that as well. And I think the history of why we are at this point where we are now, how disabled people have got their rights, is grown out of the fact that disabled people don't want to be institutionalized. So this next slide is where we get into the sort of nitty-gritty of the different models of disability: the medical model, the charity model, and the social model. And there's an image here of a slide, not a slide, a swing, a children's swing in a frozen moment. So it's a sculpture, and it's by an artist called Anna Smith, and it's called A Moment in Time. And interestingly, Anna's an artist from Wolverhampton. So those three models, the medical, the charity, and the social model, there are more models than that, but that will do for now. The medical model is the model that most of us live with, in the sense that this our education system, our media, it's the sort of norm of how disabled people are presented in the world. And it's subtle and it's not subtle. It's basically what the medical model says is, what is wrong with you? Can we fix it? That is the medical system. Can we fix you? And you're an individual. If we can't fix you, that's your problem. We'll try and make your life okay, but you're an individual. You're not part of a group of disabled people. You'll come to the medical system as an individual, and we're only looking at you with your impairment. And the medical model is ingrained into our thinking. It creates what's called ableism. Ableism is like racism or homophobia. It's the way of seeing disabled people as lesser, really. And it's ingrained within our thinking from an early age through our education and the media. And it is a sort of default that I think we can all slip into because it's so strong. I find that people are really curious to know what people's impairments are. And I think partly our monkey brains has that curiosity, but I think it's the medical model, because once you think you know what the impairment someone has, then you know who they are, but it's irrelevant. So the charity model, which sort of is very linked with the medical model, is a model that's been used by big charities where images of disabled people are used as sort of passive receivers of help to be pitied. This is less now by the national charities. That has changed, and that's only changed by disabled people getting on their case endlessly. But local charities still use that very passive and pitying images of disabled people. But one thing I must say about the national charities like MENCAP, SCOPE, RNIB, the Royal National Institute of the Blind, and RNID, Royal National Institute of the Deaf, as far as I know, not one of them is led by a disabled person or a deaf person. And they have very few disabled staff. They're massive organizations with millions of pounds of turnover, in some ways living off the back of disabled people. It's quite hard to say that, because I also think SCOPE have changed. They used to be the Spastic Society, and they realized that that name was not acceptable. But if you look at MENCAP, short for mentally handicapped, when I worked for them running a gateway club for adults with learning disabilities in the late 1980s. There was a big discussion about them changing their name, and they wouldn't do it because they said it would really reduce their funding, because they'd have to spend lots of money for people to know who was the new organization with a different name, which to me says the very fact that they have a name that says mentally handicapped is okay, says it all. Going back to the medical model, one of the things that underlines a medical model is the philosophy of eugenics. Now, a lot of things I'm saying here sound very black and white, and it's not that I'm saying that the medical profession want to exterminate disabled people, because that's not true. But eugenics, which grew out, actually, the eugenics started in the 19th century with Herbert Spencer. He used the term survival of the fittest, which Darwin used in his theory of evolution, to not mean the fittest in the sense that if you took 5 people and they had a fight, the person who was left at the end standing was the fittest. He meant in, like, say you took a group of birds who work as a group, or a group of animals like antelopes, any herd, that group, the fittest is about the group, not the individual, because actually if you have a very strong individual, it doesn't work best for the group. But he turned it on the head, and he said, what we need is a society with the people who are less fit should be evolved out of our society. And that's when eugenics started to form. And it went through into the 20th century. Mary Stopes, who started contraception. Brilliant work, because great work for the sort of liberation of women, and that women didn't have to have loads of kids. But underneath it, she was a eugenicist as well, where she believed that the working class, that we could end up with a society that was full of people who were less intellectually able, that the IQ of society would drop. So it's a bit concerning when you realize that. And the Nazis took it to the extreme, and I think about 200,000 disabled people died during the time that the Nazis were reigning with Germany. But some people would say that the last 10 years of this government, with austerity, where 17,000 disabled people have died as a consequence of the benefit cuts, could be looked as eugenics. So I hope you're not come for a fun night out. One of the slogans used against the charities back in the 1980s and 1990s, a disability rights slogan, was "Piss on Pity," and nothing about us without us. And I think that especially nothing about us without us is a really good model to think of when you're involving disabled people in life. So onto the social model. So the social model was the key, really, of the beginning of the disability rights movement in 1975. It counters the medical model by saying that disability is a social construct. It exists because society is not accessible to disabled people. So disability exists because society is not accessible to disabled people. And this lack of access is what creates disabled people. If you had a fully accessible society, there would only be people with impairments. So it's a great model. It's not perfect, but then nothing is perfect. It's got its crunchy bits. But the best thing about it is it's very simple to understand. The very fact that a simple one, a wheelchair user can't get up steps. If you're a deaf person and interpreters aren't provided, then you can't communicate with other people unless they're a BSL user. So I think you can see, if you turn it on its head and that those access requirements are met, then disabled people can function on the same level as non-disabled people. this was going to be a song, which I'm not going to play now, but I'll give you a little bit of a background to it. Matt Fraser, some of you will know, some of you won't, but he's been a key person in the in disability arts. He's one of like the first disabled people who's crossed the other side and got into the mainstream. He's presented programs on Channel 4, and he's been on BBC. He's got a high profile, and he's regularly used in a lot of TV programs. And he's a great actor, and that's why. But he's also got his persona as a disabled person. So his mum took thalidomide when she was pregnant with him. So he's got very short arms. So in this song, he says there will always be disabled people. And he says, however much you want to try and say, use screening of fetuses to try and terminate fetuses that have impairments, there'll always be disabled people because there will be different pollutants, there are different things that will come into the environment that will create more disabled people. So basically it's saying, why are you doing it? What is your thinking behind it? He's recently been on Crypt Tales, which was 5, I think, or 6 shorts of about 10, 12 minutes on BBC that were about this is the 25th anniversary of the Disability Discrimination Act. So that was part of why they were shown. And Matt's was about going for auditions. Liz Carr, who anyone who's a fan of Silent Witness will know her as, oh God. If the audience were here, if we were doing this live, I'd get someone to shout out what her name is. It's not Claudia, Clarissa. And Liz Carr's another great actor. And I think the fact that people like Matt and Liz are breaking through to the other side and being seen. In fact, I think I've heard Liz has got a contract in Hollywood for some feature film, is showing things are moving on. But sometimes it feels like a drop in the ocean, like a few people are allowed to cross the barrier. Whoa, time is going on. So Access. This is a painting of Subert Massey by Tanya Raber. So Subert, he was the first chair of the Disability Rights Commission, and that was set up after the Disability Discrimination Act became law. And Tanya Raber, she's a great disabled artist. She's a painter and predominantly a portrait artist. Not everyone loves her portraits, which I love about her, because she's not a 100% representational. Her work is funky, and you'll see a few more pieces of her work. She's done a series of portraits of disabled people who've been the influencers on the movement. So access, because I mentioned that in the social model, what do we mean by access, and why is access such an issue? One of the things we do at Dash is we work with a lot of organizations about access, and the simple side of access, say like building a ramp instead of stairs, putting in a lift. I think people can get their heads around that. It's a functional change. It's the sort of thing you might do in your home in some way, making your home more comfortable. It's like a building thing. It's when we talk about more intellectual and emotional support and access requirements that people have, it gets to be more complex. And some of them, access can cost money, there's no doubt on that. And I think that also is where organizations don't always get that right, because they don't think it through and actually think that you can do it on the cheap. And you can't, because interpreters cost money and you've got to put in a budget. And if you don't need interpreters, you can use that money for other things. But without access, there's no way that disabled artists are going to be able to access the art world, and disabled people access the world. So access is fundamental. And why is it rare for disabled people's access requirements to met? It's a good question. I think it's because it's like this medical model and the social model. You have to change your way of thinking, and you have to start from what do we need to do to make access right, and the people we need to ask are the disabled and deaf people we're going to be working with, because if we don't ask them, we'll get it wrong. So it goes back to nothing about us without us. So the people who know about access are the people who use access, who are the disabled people. Awkward Bastards and Doug Paulley. This isn't Doug Paulley, this image here. This is of Nabil Shaban, who's another influencer in the disability arts world. Nabil started Grey Eye Theatre Company started in 1970. And any Doctor Who fans, he was also in Doctor Who. So it's another portrait by Tanya. So why the term Awkward Bastards? We started using that at Dash for 2 symposiums we did at the Mac in Birmingham. And it's the feeling when you say or do something and people wish you would disappear. It's that feeling like it goes a bit quiet and you realize that you're making people feel awkward and you're an awkward bastard. We need this attitude to make change happen. We need to cause that discomfort, and we need to be awkward bastards if change happens. So why I put Doug Paulley there? Some of you might have picked up there was a case with First Transport Group, who are a bus company, and I think they also do trains. And Doug lives up in Yorkshire, and he's a wheelchair user. He was going to get on a bus, and the wheelchair space was taken up with a buggy. The driver refused to ask the person with the buggy to move it, and said he couldn't get on the bus because it wasn't a safe space for him to get on there. So the bus went on, and Doug was left behind, and he took the company to court, and it was found in his favour. And now drivers of buses have to ask someone who has a buggy to move the buggy so the wheelchair user can get there. Before, the drivers didn't want to intervene. That's what it says on paper. I still think this goes on. Also, one of the real negatives of this is it pits disabled people, wheelchair users, against people with children. And in fact, the bus company should look at a way that both can be accommodated, not one or the other. But he's got loads of films on YouTube, and they're quite amazing to watch, because he's been campaigning against National Express, the coach company, because they are meant to be providing accessible buses, and their buses do have a way that a wheelchair user can get in. So he went, amongst one thing is when he went, I think he was going to travel from Bradford to Leeds, but he bought something like 6 tickets because it's plenty of coaches in the day. So he's going to travel backwards and forwards 6 times. Each time he turned up at the coach, the driver said, have you booked in advance? He said, no, I don't need to book in advance. Your buses are accessible. And he was so calm, and the drivers were fine with him, but they just were put in this awful position that he would say, I'm sorry that's happening to you, but you haven't been trained properly. And he put himself through it just so that he would be able to get the bus company to change and train their drivers how they could operate the lift, move the chair, a fixed seat out of the way so that a wheelchair user could be accommodated. So I would say Doug is an awkward bastard, but he deals with people, some of the trains, people really start to lose it with him. And he just keeps really calm and reminds them of the situation and that why they're treating him like that. So yeah, if we had like the equivalent of the Oscars, I would award him Awkward Bastard of the Year. So we get on to the Disability Discrimination Act, 1995. And on this page here, we've got work by Sue Austin. And the work on the right is called Fish Pinnacle. And Sue got quite a lot of funding to create an underwater wheelchair, which is quite an amazing idea. And she went off to, I think it was the Red Sea, and she was taught scuba diving as well, and made this amazing, iconic photos, and also a film. So I think you can find that work online as well of hers. You think that might be enough for someone just to be able to go underwater in a wheelchair, but she decided that wasn't enough, and she's got her pilot license, so that she's set up a not a hang glider, maybe it is a hang glider, not a paraglider, but so she's been learning to fly. And she has crashed once as well, so it doesn't give up. She doesn't give up. So the Disability Discrimination Act, the DDA, 1995, the Race Relations Act, 1976, the Sex Discrimination Act, 1975. So it took 20 years after those acts came in for disabled people for it to be illegal to discriminate against disabled people. And it would be brilliant if the DDA had not had no teeth. All it could do was gum you. It had no bite. It was built around this term, reasonable adjustment. So it asked people to make reasonable adjustment so that disabled people could get into your shop, take part, get your services. And you can imagine that if you were a lawyer and you heard the word reasonable adjustment, you would be thinking about buying your third Ferrari or your second luxury yacht, because it could only be sorted by case law, what reasonable adjustment, because the word reasonable, everybody has a different idea what reasonable is. So what a nightmare. And at that time, transport and education weren't in the original Disability Discrimination Act. Education became part of it in 2001 and transport in 2016. So that up to that time, before 2016, Doug Paulley wouldn't have been able to take that bus company to court because it wouldn't have been illegal. I'm just going to read something by Mike Oliver and Colin Barnes, because they're both been key people in the creation of the social model in the early part of the disability rights movement. And they wrote this in 2006, so it's quite late, but I think it's so pertinent, so apt for this time. We still believe that the only viable long-term political strategy for disabled people is to be part of a far wider struggle to create a better society for all. It is a struggle that must take on board the fact that 21st century Britain is the society near the top of world league tables for illiteracy, not literacy, but illiteracy, teenage pregnancy, childhood obesity, school exclusions, and relative poverty. All of this must be contextualized within a global society characterized by an exploding human population, growing cultural conflict, climatic change, and environmental degradation. These are the issues that today's generation will almost certainly have to address if the struggle for society fit for all is to be achieved. So they wrote that in 2006, so that's 14 years ago. And I would certainly say that what they say about Britain has gone even further in that time. And Michelle Taylor, she writes something here. She's on she is the director for change of Ramps on the Moon, which is a project in about 6 theatres to bring more disabled actors, backstage people as well. The logic of the social model reinforces the illogicality of people with a disability, because that's a common term. There's a people first movement, since it argues that disability is not something I have, rather medical conditions or impairments are the things I have. Instead, I am disabled by the refusal of society to design, build, and maintain environments that enable me to function just as seamlessly as people without these medical conditions. In other words, disabled. Here, disabled is a verb. It's done to me. So we are disabled people. Because language is important. What is the right language? If you want to know what the right language to use, you should ask the person and how they want to be described. Is nothing without us, about us without us. Because a list of right language is totally useless, because it's actually up to the person how they want to be described. I don't want to go on too much longer, because I want to leave a bit of time for questions. So I'll run through this last bit quite quickly. This is an artist called Vacuum Cleaner. He's called Vacuum Cleaner because he's cleaning up after capitalism. And he's an artist, comes out of the mental health background, and he's an art activist. And so how does change happen? It's a gradual process. It's collective process and action. Changes in the laws come from action. They come from outside. Change comes from intention, from desire to change, openness to change, vision to understand change, and action. I'm rushing a little bit here. I was going to talk quite a bit more then. Here's some work by Nancy Willis, who's one of the artists who's been around probably since the 70s and 80s. Her work's really beautiful. This is Self-Portrait 2. So capitalism, productivity in Cuba, the position of disabled people in a capitalist society. I mean, there's a lot of books written about this, but we are looked on as flawed, unproductive workers. Henry Ford, who was a eugenicist, he analyzed workers to get the maximum out of them. So he treated people as machines. I mean, Henry Ford would have loved if robots could replace people. He would have loved that back in the 20s and 30s. So why I brought Cuba in is it's not a perfect society. Certainly it's disabled people are still under a medical system there, the medical model. And it's got loads of flaws. But one of the things that really interests me is the equal pay system it has. And doctors, bus drivers, cleaners, carers, teachers were all on the same pay. It has changed now. But what that meant was that you had a different value system. Someone who swept the streets, someone who was a carer for someone was valued equally as someone who was a doctor, say. Also, they've got great music and they know how to dance. This is an image by Juan Delgado, and it's an extract from his film Altered Landscapes. And this is about Syrian refugees making the journey from Turkey into Europe. Well, actually, Turkey is part of Europe, but into Western Europe. And I think I will read Richard Downes' poem. This is another picture by Nancy Willis called Self-Portrait Number 1. So the poem by Richard Downes, The Marcher. They've gone too far. I'm going on a march. Stand up for my people. Sit in front of cars. We'll turn this wrong about. When we hit the street again, stand up for our rights. Hang out with our friends. Right this wrong together. It's the only thing to do. The system never listens. It just wants to shit on you. Tell them what is wrong, what we are standing for. Speaking up forever. We will change our laws. We will change our planet. We'll improve our lives. We'll bring smiles and laughter to those who have survived. This one for the marchers, a fight we always fought. This one for our dreamers, our schemes are not for naught. We're speaking for a change, a brave new world of being. I have heard their voices, a future I am seeing, a future I am seeing of a new society. This one for the better, it sets our people free. And that's it. I'm sorry that we've only got about 13 minutes for questions. And there was so much more. I haven't talked about the Disability Action Network, DAM, who chained themselves to buses in London. So it's only scratched the surface. But I'll hand over to Claire, who I think we're going to work together on the questions, and I'll do very brief answers.
Yes, thanks, Mike. That was great. So interesting. I mean, there's so much stuff there that I didn't know about. So, you know, it's just a massive learning curve. Thanks so much. A few questions here. So one from Rebecca, it's more of a comment really, but I think it could lead on to a question. It was back to when you were talking about the Nazis and the gas chambers. She said that the government want to exterminate us and that we're one step away from that kind of mindset returning. What are your thoughts on that?
When the Tory government got elected in 2010, a good friend of mine said, don't worry, the Tories are very patronising to disabled people, but they always look after them. It might be very patronising, patting on the head. And he said after like 6 months, I got that wrong. So particularly those first times under Cameron and Osborne, where the Sun would have exposés on, you know, these disabled fraudsters. They're taking, you know, this woman says she's a wheelchair user, and then look, we got pictures of her at a fun fair, all the time undermining the idea that disabled people should be valued, to actually that they're fraudsters and cheats, and that most of them are pretending that those people you see in wheelchairs can actually get up and walk, and it's just their benefit scroungers. And that hasn't been changed. They've never apologized, they've not changed it. And the way that people have been going through the assessments for disability and living allowance onto personal independence payments has meant so many disabled people have lost their money, because the system has been set up to, you fail your assessment and then you appeal, but so many people don't because of the stress that they've gone through. And that's why a lot of those people have committed suicide, because of the process they've gone through.
That's dreadful, isn't it? Oh gosh. Thanks for that comment, Rebecca. But it's important stuff, isn't it? You know, however painful, it's important. This one from Lucy. Mike, are there any articles, books or documentaries on disabled history that you would recommend? I hear so little about this topic and I'd like to know more. Yeah, same for me, Lucy.
What I was going to say there, because our book doesn't come straight up, though there are loads, and the Leeds University has a disability studies unit that's sort of like world leading. In fact, Colin Barnes, who was part of the writing the social model, is one of the professors there. And they have an archive that, unusually for a higher education institution, is accessible to anyone. If you put into Google Leeds University Disability Studies Unit archive, you'll get into it, and it's probably got 1,000 or more extracts or full sort of PDFs from different publications, and it will give you the lead into particular books as well. But I regularly dip into it because there's a lot of good writing in there.
Okay, great. That's really useful. Thank you. And just a comment from Cruz said, "Thank you, Mike. That was so interesting," and I echo that. Does anyone else have any more questions they want to type before we go? Mike, is there anything you want to add while we hang on a bit?
I just think we're living in really interesting times. That who would have thought 9 months ago what we've been through? Because I mean, I think one of the things that I'm doing a lot is I'm probably doing too much Zoom. It's sounding like a drug, isn't it? Doing too much Zoom, but I'm working with, I'm mentoring artists all around the UK, and in fact one in Germany and one in Vancouver in Canada. And it's, what's so special about that is, but I wouldn't have done that in March or February this year. So that is things are changing, and I really hope that what is building are sort of very grassroots networks where people are connecting and looking at ways to create structures, because I think we are facing a real unknown. I think financially we've got to expect that we're going to get a real hit, and it's probably not the rich will get hit, it will be the poor as usual. There's a lot of songs about that that are quite rude. And I think we need to be prepared, and I think the way through it is by looking after each other and having those networks that support each other. And so, yeah, the struggle goes on.
Yeah,
we need to look after each other.
We do indeed, more so than ever, I think. We've got a few more questions, Mike, if you're okay to answer them. So this one from Jane Webb. Hi Jane, how are you doing? Great talk, thank you. I was wondering if there was any equivalent set of designers who are concerned with disability rights.
Designers?
Yeah.
I'm thinking, I wonder if, Jane, do you mean like architects and building designers? Can Jane answer us?
Okay, we'll come back to that one. Jane, if you can pop that in the Q&A. Next question's from Joe Paul. Do you think disability history could or should be taught in schools, just as Black and racial cultural history is being pushed and encouraged to be on the education agenda recently? Do you think there could be ever be an appetite for that?
It's a good question, Joe, because I was reading something where Black activists were talking about how they don't feel like colonial history is taught in schools. It's not analysed and it's not taught from a Black history perspective. So if that isn't taught, then how can Black young people understand where they've come from? And so disability history has to be taught if we're going to be, it's the young minds we need to change, not to say that old minds like mine can't change, but I think young people are open to ideas and flexible. And I think that's the place it should be. Yeah, we should be teaching it and looking at looking at disabled people back through history and key places that what they've done, as is being done through Black history.
Okay, thank you for that question. This one from Kieran H. Hi Mike, in an ideal world, where would you like accessibility in the arts to be in the next 5 years?
Okay, I was just going to come back to Jane, and in a way that partly will go with Kieran, because I think you must be talking about like designers of building, like architects, because she's a really good trainer and artist, Zoe Partington, who's partially sighted, and she's been working with the what are they called, the RA, it's the Architectural Institution, I think, but it's like the main body for architects, working with young architects who are students about accessible design. Because it's right, once a building's built, if it hasn't, and it's not just about the ramps, it's about the lighting, what works for different people, for neurodivergent people, the lighting's really important, and how the layout is, partially sighted and blind people, similar how those structures are. So it's got to be done, it's got to be in the mindset from the beginning. So for Kieran's, what I'd like to see is we're training up with galleries, disabled curators. I want to see those curators in key positions in nationally recognized galleries, so that they're changing that canon of disability art, because they're bringing disabled artists in to show their work. Retrospectives of people like Tanya Raba and Nancy Willis, particularly Nancy, like, why shouldn't artists only get their work shown after they die? And that's so common. And so I really would like Nancy to have a retrospective of work while she's alive. Yeah, and I just think where access isn't a conversation, where people don't ring you up and say, well, what should we do? They know what to do because they've done it.
Jane's just got back to us. She said, yes, she did mean that. You mean Reba.
Yeah, Ariba, thank you.
Yeah.
Jane. Yeah, so that work is happening, but obviously I've just mentioned one person, Zoe, and she can't change the world on her own. She's done a lot of stuff around the Olympics. She's gone out for the Paralympics, but it needs probably 10 Zoes or 20 or 100 Zoes for those changes start to happen and be fundamental.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that question. Joanne White says, how would you tell people to get involved in campaigning?
Um, I mean, it's an interesting one, that, because not everyone feels comfortable to campaign, and I guess it's a campaigning. I suppose what is campaigning? Because there's active roles and then there's more support and background roles, and I guess it's finding organisations that are doing the work that you like, what they're doing. It's interesting. I mean, we're in a position where so much campaigning happens on social media, and you can almost be your own one person campaign tool. Because it is interesting how any particularly businesses, and I would say the same would be true for arts organizations, negative publicity on social media is to be avoided, because it can spread very fast and it can damage your reputation. So I think subtlety, but sometimes not subtlety. I haven't really answered it that well, because I think it's you finding the people you want to work with.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that question. This one from Anonymous. Do you know the National Disability Arts Collection and Archive as well?
Oh, thanks. I should have mentioned that, shouldn't I? Because it's goes back to the whole National Disability Arts Collection, the archive, which is down in University of Buckingham University, and that was set up by Shape Arts in London. And some of that work that you saw, like Tony's piece of the Great Britain from a wheelchair, are within that collection. And the idea of the collection is to start to challenge that whole art history. I mean, if you haven't got an archive of work somewhere, a collection of work, then there isn't a way you can say there is this movement. And it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And it's already having an influence. It's only been open for about 2 years now, but it's certainly having an impact.
Okay, next question is from Severio Cantoni. He says, in the time of rising majority, how important is it to create solidarity between marginalised artists from different discriminative perspectives, non-normative bodies, disabled bodies? Sorry, I couldn't read that last word. Sorry, yeah, did you get that, Mike?
I got that, yeah. Hi, Severio. I think one of the things that we have to do, it goes back a bit to that piece I read out by, what was their name? By Colin Barnes and, here we go, Colin and Mike Oliver, is that we need to join together. We need to be, I've come up with this word, I haven't come up with it, it's been used for a while. I think it's come actually out of feminist women's studies about kin and kinship. So the struggle by Black people is one that as disabled people we should be supporting, but their struggle, isn't more important than our struggle. It's different. And I think those joining together is the key to actual change. And I think it's understanding that. And it's quite a hard thing to do, because you have your own campaign, your own battles to fight, and you need to focus on them. But I'm really interested in how those different struggles by marginalized groups can join together. Otherwise, I think we'll keep being picked off and isolated, or worse, placed against each other. That if you want that, then the other people, that marginalized group can't have it, and that's not good.
Okay, the next question is from Julia B. Will there ever become a standard for disability rather than changing from one government to another, changing the system?
I'm not quite sure what you mean, Julia, with a standard for disability, but if you mean in a sense of the rights, and let's say like Osborne and Cameron couldn't change the bringing their welfare bill, which was going to cut 4 billion out of the welfare budget. I think the battles will go on and on and on for a long time, and I think it would just have. It's just maybe it's the history of struggle that the people who have less power and have the smaller voices are the ones who will be done to, and that seems to be the rule. And what changes are when the people's voices get louder. And I think that's where collective action is so important, and it feels, yeah.
Okay. This one's from Anonymous. Can you recommend any curators with disabilities working in contemporary art today?
Aidan Mosby, who's working at MIMA as a resident there. Hannah Wallace, she's a resident at Wising Arts Centre, and she's just got the assistant curatorship at Nottingham Contemporary, which is brilliant because that's a step up that ladder. It is a ladder, but to be assistant curator means that you can apply for a curator's post after that. Those are just to name two, but actually that's the problem. Anna Berry was curator resident at MAC as well. But we didn't know of any disabled curators who identified as disabled, and there probably are a number, but we don't know of them. That's why we started our program working that way. We do know a number of curators who seem to be open to have conversations with disabled artists, which is brilliant.
Well, that brings us on to the next question, really. Do you know if there are any art galleries or artist spaces that particularly champion disabled artists?
The MAC in Birmingham seem to be, we've worked with them for about 10 years, and it does seem to be a strong thread in their work. I would say Wising Arts Centre, because they come at things from and MIMA, which is Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, they both come at things from a socially engaged practice. So they realise that they're not like the big white space that people come to, and it's up to you whether you come or not. They have to go out and work, find their community, work with their community, and not presume that the people will come to the gallery. The gallery has to go to the people. But no, and then my mind starts to go blank. I think there is a really good gallery in Derry in Northern Ireland that looks at artists who are emerging, and I would have thought there's a space there for disabled artists. So with that, there's loads and loads of galleries who are working with disabled artists and are doing short commissions and little projects, but there isn't a gallery that shows, specifically shows the work of disabled artists. And yeah, if I'm wrong, that'd be great. I'd like to know where it is.
Yeah, absolutely. We've just got a few comments here, lovely comments. Rachel says, great talk. I'm leading a disability history project with young disabled people and Norfolk museums. You've given me lots of information and food for thought.
Great.
That's a really nice comment. Thanks, Rachel. And from Emma P, Mike has been invaluable as my mentor, especially when that programming of not disabled enough comes up. Thanks, Mike. And again, greetings from Canada. So we've got some international watchers this evening, and just a few other thank yous from Anonymous. And yeah, that concludes the questions, Mike.
Great, yeah. Well, thank you, Claire, and everyone at Wolverhampton Uni, and for the interpreters as well, who
Pleasure.
I didn't shut up and give you moments to wait, did I? I just kept going. Sorry. My apologies.
It's fine. Thank you. You are wonderful. That was so interesting. And please come back again. I want to thank you, our interpreters this evening, Louise and Richard, for supporting the session. We will be uploading this talk with subtitles to the University of Wolverhampton YouTube channel over the coming days, so please keep checking for that. Our next ArtsFest online event will be on Monday, the 30th of November, and is a launch event for the history of the printed image. More information on this, including the booking details, can be found on Eventbrite. Thanks very much for watching. See you all soon.